This is the new Sigma 50mm f1.2. And if you can see it, I believe it is the smallest and lightest 50mm f1.2 currently on the market. Now, thanks to Sigma for sending this out. I do not get to keep it. It's going straight back to them. But I purposely requested to get it in Leica L mounts, mainly because Sony E mount just has so many options. It's just, I mean, obviously absurd how many options there are. And the 51.2 is already great. This is going to be coming in relatively cheaper, but I think the people that are going to be most excited about this lens are people using, you know, like the Leica SL, SL2, SL3, and then obviously people using the Lumix, the S5 II, the S5 IIX, and whatever cameras come out for this mount. So I think it makes the most sense and was most exciting for me to use in the Leica L mount, but obviously it does come in Sony E mount as well. Now, I wouldn't say this lens is small necessarily, but for what it is, being a 1.2 aperture, it is definitely much smaller than you would anticipate something like this being. It is running a 72mm filter thread, and it is as professional of a build as you could possibly get in a modern mirrorless lens. You have a single function button here they can use for things like focus hold, exposure lock. You can choose to click or declick the aperture, which is fantastic for filmmakers. And then you have a manual aperture ring, which is something that is, you know, normally happening on all of these art series lenses. And then obviously you have an AF/MF switch, just like any regular lens would have. Now, if you see this on the Lumix S5 II here, you can just see how well balanced it is, because this really does feel like a typical f1.4 lens. And it doesn't have that like wide bulk that you often get with, you know, like the Sony lens, or even like the older Canon 51.2. They were very like round and wide, and this thing definitely feels just a lot more like a 51.4, or even maybe even like a 35 1.4. It just is not a very, very big lens. And especially, I recently was able to use the 50 1.4 Summilux from Leica, and that thing is a freaking tank. It is enormous, and it makes this lens just look like a pancake lens, really. Now, all of those things are great, but like, it really comes down to how well this thing performs, and thankfully, the images coming out of this thing are fantastic. At f1.2, obviously, you're going to be getting incredibly shallow depth of field, and where that focus fall off moves from, you know, obviously focus to autofocus, it is actually really pleasing. I also think that the bokeh coming out of this is really, really nice. I didn't have a lot of issues with things being busy or just weird shapes or anything like that. Obviously, at 1.2, you're not going to have a lot of things in focus anyway, so that kind of like nice creamy background look, it's going to be something that you're obviously going to expect out of a lens like this. But the thing that did also surprise me was both the autofocus speed as well as the sharpness. Now, if you look at even this just boring test image that I took with this little focus chart thing, it is very, very, very sharp. And this is wide open at 1.2, but it also has a really nice fall off. So if you even look in the areas where, sure, it's critical focus here, but then as you move and kind of check the out of focus areas, you'll see that it's not really like hazy or weird in a way like that. It just has a really nice rendering to it, which not all lenses that are fast apertures necessarily have, if that makes sense. As far as chromatic aberration and issues like that go, this thing is not necessarily perfect, but it is very well controlled. It's definitely not an apochromatic lens, but I would definitely not say that chromatic aberration and lens issues are an issue for this necessarily at all. Now, the reason that I'm most interested in this is because 50mm at f1.2 on the Leica L mount, I don't believe there's anything else available for this system. I know that Lumix makes an S Pro lens, I believe, that is the 1.4. Obviously, Leica makes their Summilux, and Sigma makes a 1.4 as well, but this is the first lens that is a 1.2 in this system that I know of at least. And the fact that it is actually very well balanced in a camera like this is pretty exciting to me. So if I was shooting with a Leica SL system, or frankly, this Panasonic system, I would absolutely be thinking about picking this lens up. The 1.2 to 1.4, you would think that it's not that big of a deal. And in some cases it isn't, but it's just that like extra little pop, that extra little bit of softness that while critical focus happens on this lens, absolutely, there's that little bit of like extra character and stuff that you get out of a 1.2 aperture lens that gives you that like incredible separation. And it's something that in this particular system with the L mount is something that I felt like was a little bit lacking. And so if I was going to be getting into this system and using this full time, it might be the first lens that I bought outside of the basic S prime lenses that I really love from Lumix. But to have at least one lens like this that is really, really interesting and gives you something that kind of gives you more of like a wow factor was super useful. The other thing that has sort of plagued Lumix for a long time is their autofocus or lack thereof. And as we look through these photos of my son just like literally sprinting at me, you can see that even wide open at 1.2, it does a very admirable job of keeping up with him. So if you are having people sprinting at you, sure, maybe this isn't the lens for you, but I would pretty much never recommend a 51.2 to be some sort of sports lens anyway. So for the vast majority of just regular documentary coverage, for weddings, for portraiture, things like that, obviously, if you're getting the results that I'm getting from a child sprinting at me, you're going to be totally fine in most normal scenarios, focus tracking with this lens. So overall, it's pretty simple. This lens is fantastic. If I was using this system, whether on the Leica SL system or with this Panasonic system, it would absolutely be one of the lenses that I would be greatly considering picking up. It's not cheap necessarily, but especially in comparison to a lot of the other options like the Summilux, obviously, or even the Lumix S Pro lenses, it's definitely cheap enough to make it worth the while. Is it worth the difference in price between the 1.4 to this? That's going to be something that you're going to have to decide on your own. But personally, I've really, really love the look and that little bit of extra magic. And sometimes it's those little 5% differences that do make the whole difference. So thanks so much for watching. If you want to learn more about my Lumix stuff, you can check that out up here. Check out my last video on the Leica SL2 up here, and I'll see you in one of those videos.